This is part two of our dive into so-called black propaganda used by Britain and the USA during World War II. Dr. Erwin Warkentin and I dive into how propaganda used during and after the war has helped define modern Germany. Welcome to Tales Under the Cat Tree. I'm your host, Dupes. And these are tales by humans for humans. After all, words and stories are what give meaning to the worlds we live in. I like to say that stories are how we as humans program our minds. In every age of humanity, we have defined how the brain has worked based on the technologies that are prevalent at the time. For example, from steam tubes to clockwork, and now, of course, to computers. So let's say you have a computer today. Imagine that computer runs a program. The computer isn't self-aware. It knows only what the program tells it. You would think that as humans, though, we are, of course, much better at this. We are, after all, self-aware. We can certainly, or so we would like to think, distinguish between truth and lies. And yet every day, whether at work or in our personal lives, little stories change the way we perceive reality. These little stories, whether it's a comment made by a coworker or a short snippet on the television, whatever it is, can slowly change the world around you, or at least how you perceive the world around you. After a few generations, as we pass down these stories, a tyrant may seem to have become an angel, and an innocent may have become a murderer. Our own beliefs of our culture and what we believe to be true in the deepest corners of ourselves can truly be manipulated. This episode continues our dive into World War II propaganda, and believe me, it won't be the last. Dr. Erwin Warkentin has written 3 detailed books on the subject that I have linked on my show notes, and joins me today to discuss how propaganda during the Second World War, aimed at bringing down the regime, became part of the fabric of post-war Germany all the way to today. Please do take a listen to our first part of this 2-part series, episode number 65. In that episode, we delved into the use of various propaganda tactics of the Political Warfare Executive, or the PWE, and the work of Sefton Delmer. So let's continue the discussion with Dr. Warkentin where we left it.
Hi, I'm Erwin Warkentin, and I'm here for the second part of our discussion of porn and the Nazi Empire. And now in part 2, we're going to talk about how that has affected the world today.
Last week, when we went over the PWE, the Political Warfare Executive of the Allied forces in Britain, and how they conducted a campaign of basically propaganda using pornography and all sorts of other, what you called black propaganda, into the Nazi regime. So now we've come to the end of the war. The regime has fallen, but the propaganda still exists. And not only that, it continues on to even the present day. So walk me through what actually happened from then to now.
The funny thing is that a lot of these people went on to become rather significant individuals, within the media. That's one of the biggest effects. There's a guy by the name of Mashevitz. I don't know does the name ring a bell at all?
No, unfortunately, no.
No, it doesn't. He's the creator of Doctor Who.
Oh my. One of my favorite TV shows.
Yes, and he was actually one of the people involved in the PWE, and he was one of their lecturers. In other words, they actually ran a school for people that were coming in to teach them how to write propaganda. He went on, right after the war ended in Europe, he went off into Asia, and I think he worked in India for some time, in Burma. And then he came back to the UK. He immediately went into the BBC, and one of the first things he created was Doctor Who. So there's an interesting sort of parallel between a lot of these people that had created this propaganda ended up in the media. whether it was in the UK or the United States, or one of the big ones was Radio Luxembourg. I don't know if you're familiar with Radio Luxembourg. Used to be a thing back in the 70s when I visited Germany. It was kind of this great big radio station that just broadcast everywhere, and everybody was listening to it. It's kind of disappeared since then, but Radio Luxembourg was one of the original pieces put in place after the war by the British and the Americans in order to control media broadcasting in Europe. So it had that long-term effect as well. And by calling it Radio Luxembourg, kind of cloaked exactly who was pulling the strings on this one. So you still had this media presence, and it was a big media presence.
Just out of curiosity, was Radio Luxembourg ever broadcast out of Luxembourg?
Yes, it was. It was actually stationed in Luxembourg. It had the luxury of having an excellent location, in that it was kind of in the middle of everything. France and Spain were off to the west, and Germany and Austria and such were off to the east, and to the south you had Italy. So it could actually cover a good part of Europe. And more importantly, it could also cover a lot of what became East Germany, the DDR, the German Democratic Republic. So it actually broadcast into there as well. And one of the more interesting recent statistics that I saw has to do with voting here in Germany. And the eastern part, what was the DDR, what was, the old East Germany, they tend to vote for the AfD. That's this right-wing party here, far right-wing party. But where you see their strongest support is on the periphery. That is where Radio Luxembourg couldn't reach. And so it's interesting to see the parallel between where the Western broadcasts kind of ended and where this really, really strong right-wing support is in Germany. So you can't say that this is definitive, but it kind of looks suspicious that, there might be something that's going on, that these radio stations after the war had more of an effect than we might want to think they did. They had a powerful effect after the war, also in terms of how Germans saw themselves. Of course, the Germans were then told that, hey, the Holocaust happened. And initially, the Americans were of the position that all Germans were guilty. But that changed within about 6 months of the end of the war, as the Americans started shifting more. Well, no, we have to be a little bit more selective about who we blame for this. You can't just blame an entire people.
And what I find fascinating is as the Americans went in and liberated those camps. In fact, I have an episode where I talked about Moish Kantorowicz, a Holocaust survivor. And in the show notes, there are actually the videos that the American army shot as they went along. And they released, of course, afterwards. I guess they did find out that actually many people didn't know this was happening. And, there were suspicions, there were thoughts, but actually most people didn't know that many of the things that were happening, or at least the extent to which it was happening.
I would tend to agree with you, but there is one conversation that I had. You probably remember someone by the name of Elfie Boehm.
Yes, of course I do remember her.
We had a conversation about that once, and I was talking about, the German feelings of guilt and who knew what, and so on and so forth. She was a little girl during the war, and what she said kind of stuck with me. They had this, when you skip, they have these sayings, right? I don't remember any of them necessarily, but when you're skipping, girls skip, and then they have little poems. And she talked about, if we were to trip on these jump ropes, then we would end up in Auschwitz. And then she looked at me and she said, how would a little girl know about Auschwitz and it being a bad place if everyone else didn't?
That's fair.
I think there were suspicions, and to some degree it might be that they didn't want to know. I suspect, I'm not going to make myself better than other people. I didn't live through it. I was born, 14 years after the war ended. I can see how you might not want to believe it's true, but have the suspicion that it might be, because people disappeared, and where would they go to? They had talks about the midnight cruiser, a car coming by and people being taken away at midnight from their homes. And this is very often the way it happened. So there were these subtle indications that it might have been the case.
We're, of course, getting a little bit off track in terms of
Yeah.
propaganda that was then used. But there was re-education that needed to happen, or there was departments of re-education.
I could talk about the Americans. The British had something that was very, very similar, but I've done a little bit more work with the American system, and that was called the ICD, Information Control Division. They were also responsible for re-education. And for them, education had everything to do with information and access to it and the type of information you were given. And so this meant that if you wanted to run a newspaper, if you wanted to run a radio station, if you wanted to be a publisher, if you wanted to run a theater, you had to go to the Information Control Office and fill out a Fragebogen, a questionnaire. And that was on top of the regular questionnaire that everybody else had to. This one was long and massive. You had to demonstrate your political bona fides, that is, that you were someone who didn't agree with the Nazis. And the best thing would be that you had demonstrated that you had fought against them in some sort of way. And then you would be issued a license to publish or to run a theater. If you printed a church bulletin for Sunday morning for your parishioners, you had to have a license in order to do that. And so they controlled, who could actually do the publishing, who could then put out the information that people were getting. And that way they could ensure that only their information or the information they considered appropriate would get out. And so there were ways of getting people to kind of toe the line. You may remember a few years ago, there was an incident in Cologne at New Year's. And that was where there were a number of women who had been sexually assaulted, had been raped, and other things that happened at this New Year's celebration. And these were people from the outside, shall we say. A lot of them happened to be these Syrian refugees that had been allowed into Germany. And I'm not going to talk so much about that, but the paralysis that took place in the media on how to report on that. They had always been taught right from the get-go, right from when they started with the Information Control Division and the British equivalent, that you can't say bad things about foreigners. You can't say these sorts of things about refugees. That's simply not going to happen. And there was this paralysis that appeared in all of the newspapers and all of the media on how to report that. They just didn't know how to do it. And I would have to suggest that that's actually a direct effect. And there's a lot of other commentators that had talked about, why this was the case, how could this happen? And then they had kind of gone back to there not really being a tradition in Germany of reporting on these things. And I would then say, yeah, well, the reason they didn't have that tradition is because it wasn't allowed to be all the way back in 1945, 46, 47, 48, with this Information Control Division. Simply was not going to happen because they, at that time, had the same sorts of issues. And in their case, it was a lot of the people who had been former inmates of the concentration camps and such who suddenly found themselves free, found themselves liberated. At the same time, many of them came from Eastern Europe and they did not want to go back to the USSR or to Poland or, that part of the world. And so they ended up in Germany and they started taking their revenge, as it were, on the Germans. And so the newspapers were simply told at the time, you cannot report on that. And so that kind of got fossilized within the German media environment, because of what had happened in the past. And there you can draw a direct line, from the PWE, the Political Warfare Executive, to the Psychological Warfare Division of the actual army. and then into the ICD, the Information Control Division, and then it changed its name a couple of times in the process, and it just kind of carried over, just carried forward.
Going back to the PWE and the propaganda that they ran during the war, you said in the previous episode, the British and the Allied forces, or perhaps the British mostly and the Americans, were very much concerned about rebuilding Germany afterwards. What they wanted to do was to create a new Europe after the war. They didn't think about if they would win the war. They thought about when they would win. So how did the work of the propaganda that they ran during the war impact not just this kind of stuff, but what was the impact in rebuilding?
The problem in rebuilding Germany, not everybody was on side with rebuilding Germany. There was a fellow by the name of Henry Morgenthau. He was big part of the Roosevelt administration. He had a kind of a personal issue in this, in that he was featured in a German propaganda film called Der ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew. There was a film clip of him identifying him as the typical Jewish banker. And so he had a kind of a personal stake in all of this. And he really wanted to turn Germany into an agrarian society where there was no industry or anything like that. But very quickly, the American military said, well, that's not going to happen. That's way too difficult to accomplish. There's way too much here. Besides, you're going to end up with the same situation you did at the end of the First World War. The Germans will then somehow rebuild, and you're going to have the same problem, only it's going to be even worse the next time around. And what the Americans eventually then did decide was to pour money into Germany. And one of the reasons, when we think of Germany and Germans today, in particular in the Western world, if you talk about the United States and Canada and such, if you say, hey, paint me a picture of German, they will paint you a picture of a Bavarian at Oktoberfest, with a stein of beer, maybe with an accordion across the woman is going to be wearing a dirndl and all the rest of it. Because that's the image that they then brought back with them. And that's where the money went at the end of the war, or after the end of the war, I should say. The Bavarians often talk about, we're really quite wealthy and all the rest of it. Well, they weren't really wealthy until the American money showed up in 1945 and 1946 and started rebuilding the place. In that respect, we have this skewed image of Germany. From that, we still have this image of the Northern German as being very dour and very serious and all the rest of it. That's still an image that we carry on from the war. So these are things that are really quite significant in how Germans even see themselves, because you can point to very specific propaganda pieces that were created by the PWE during the war that is trying to create this friction between the various groups in Germany. That is, first of all, Northern and Southern, but then particularly between Bavarians and everybody else. And then you have this thing about they had a particular hatred on for Prussia. Well, Prussia was destroyed, it doesn't exist any longer. That still plays into this. But then they've simply said, the Northern Germans are essentially Prussians. So this is still at work. And then, of course, the people in Baden-Württemberg, they're all just happy people who like to eat their spätzle. I don't know if that's the worst sort of image you can have of someone. But again, that's very much a wartime and post-war creation of the German occupation.
The impacts go far beyond World War II and Germany, because the techniques that Seft and Delmer used, they may have been started in World War I, carried out in World War II. I would imagine you and I could have a conversation, even if briefly, about how those same techniques are around us today.
First of all, if you look at the radio program, Der Chef, this hour has 22 minutes. The Heute Show in Germany, Veep, The Daily Show, Last Week Tonight. I can't imagine them as existing without some of these early forerunners. And remember, the people that wrote for Sefton Delmer ended up writing for shows like The Thick of It, Yes Minister, and then later Yes Prime Minister, and The New Statesman. So you have the same sort of mentality, going into these programs that were during the Second World War. And you can't tell me that something like The New Statesman, I don't know if you're familiar with that program, it is an utterly vicious, vicious look at British politics. This is British political satire, them satirizing themselves. These are the same people that, started writing stuff way back when during the Second World War, and they're carrying on this tradition. So you can see very little difference, for example, between, Der Chef and these other programs that were created then. Now, if you think of stuff like The Daily Show and Last Week Tonight, the humor that they use and the irreverence that they have and the language that they sometimes will use is little different from what you would find in something that was being broadcast to Germany. One thing that I do need to point out, and it is relevant to today, they did an awful lot of research into how often they actually, or how much truth needs to be contained in any broadcast. And they came to the number of between 14 and 20%. The rest can be pure fabrication, and people will believe it. As long as you have this 14 to 20%, you're golden, you're fine.
So that brings us to today's world of AI, fake news that we call fake news, which is, of course, propaganda, but images that are created, the memes that are sent. And you're saying that basically, if I can see a meme that has 14 to 20% of truth in it, it is probably likely. And then the rest of it is crap and fake. But I would actually go.
Exactly. And I have no reason to believe that they haven't done the same research that I have, and they've come to pretty much the same realization. I should kind of maybe back all of it. This is now the scholar, the academic in me kicking in. I should tell you how I come to this 14 to 20%. The PWE was kind enough. They had news broadcasts that they sent to Germany. And I have it's about approximately 500,000 words in these various scripts that they used. And so I know exactly what they said, and I can very carefully go through it and read what they broadcast to Germany. They were very, very kind to me as a researcher. As I was going through these documents, I had noticed that there were lines on the documents. And at the top of one of them, all of a sudden it said, sidelining indicates truth.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And then I dug into that a little deeper. So what I could then do is I could count exactly which words or which sentences were true and which were fabrication. Now, there was a reason they did this, and that is radio. You can't just target Germany. If you go to Kent and you put the signaling station there and you're broadcasting, it's going to go over the rest of the UK as well. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't go just to Germany. And their concern was they were getting comebacks that indicated, first of all, that the British were listening to these German broadcasts and they were actually believing what was in these broadcasts. And so they went, oh my. And the next discussion that they had was, what about us? What happens if we start believing the bullshit ourselves? And so someone came up with the idea that we need to check our broadcasts. And after that, you could see that the first 2 months or so of these broadcasts, they didn't indicate anything. But then suddenly it started. And as these memos were being circulated, you could see they started marking up the transcripts. And for them, it was simply a matter of, we have to make sure that we know what's true. And so part of the problem is it's not just your target audience believing something. There's also the danger of you yourself believing the bullshit. And so they had to go through these documents and indicate what's true and what's not. And that's how I come up with this 14 to 20%. The reason I say 14 to 20% is every day is going to be a little bit different. There were some days at the very beginning where about 50% of it was true. And you could actually see as you go towards the end of the war, there's less truth and there's more bullshit. So it's a fascinating thing. And then they continue to broadcast after the end of the war, and I guess you get into a habit, and nothing changed. You didn't have to BS them anymore, but you still continued to do so. It was really quite fascinating to watch that happen. So yeah, when I say that it's 14 to 20%, I know that because I've gone through that. I've compiled the statistics on it. Anyone who wants to, they're more than welcome to go to Kew Gardens, to Kew in London, and pull out the documents and count it for themselves.
It's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm suspecting that we'll actually come back to some of these themes and discussions and some of your research, because of course this is not one book but many books that you've written on the subject. We should probably link to all of those in our show notes so that people can find them.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. You can get them at your library. They're because they're kind of academic books. They tend to be a little more on the expensive side, but you can get electronic versions of them, or you can buy electronic versions of them. Most universities actually carry the books, so you would be able to get them from your university library.
So, Dr. Warkentin, I imagine we're going to come back, as I said, to many of these topics in the future. Thank you again for coming on the air and sharing your incredible knowledge on the subject.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and maybe at some point we can talk about bots and algorithms.
Well, and I'm pretty sure a lot of that started in World War II as well. So, hey. As I noted during the episode, there are some images provided by Erwin on my show notes at tales.dupes.ca. That's tales.dups.ca. There are also links to history books. I will be summarizing both these episodes into a written account for my Substack. We will definitely have more episodes on propaganda. I have already started planning the next one. Thank you to Dr. Erwin Warkentin for his time, his extensive research, and getting me all the material. If you want to reach Dr. Warkentin or myself, you can send a message to contact@dups.ca. Listen to the archives wherever you get your podcasts or at tales.dupes.ca. This podcast is about the worlds we create, the realities we conjure, and the wonders of the human imagination. This podcast, including its intro music, is produced, edited, and created by me, your host, Dilip Ujewardena. If you are lucky enough to have a pet, give them some treats and a cuddle until we meet again for some tales under the cat tree.